Hi everyone. So today we have a great session here. We are bringing two very different perspectives. One as a technology provider, one as a technology user, right? It could have been any two companies here, from the technology provider side, from the technology user side. It just happens to be us. And so what we're going to do now is, first of all, thanks very much for attending. I know the conference is kind of winding down, and you've probably been through a lot of presentations, but hear us out. So I'm Atul Tulshibagwale. I'm CTO of Signal. Before I was at Signal, I used to be at Google. Some of you might know me from the continuous access evaluation protocol blog that I wrote when I was at Google. It seemed to have gotten on a little bit. It's now a standard, and in the OpenID Foundation, I'm now on the board of the OpenID Foundation as well. And so that's a little bit about me. And
yeah, so Mark Neiswinger. I work for Disney, and I've been with the company for 26 years. I've been in identity for about 14 or 15 of those, and am responsible for all security aspects of our identity portfolio across the company. And excited to have a conversation about this great topic.
Great.
You want
to? I just.
Oh, you got it. Great.
So.
Yeah, so we want to start with a little bit of the scary story, right? You always start with that first. We know that there's a huge potential for breaches across the companies that that are in the identity space today. And the reality is, it's not even to talk about the breach side of things, but even just, I'm sure everybody in this room, whether you know it or not, have probably experienced at least either unauthorized access or even unintended access, right? We know we have a massive access and entitlement sprawl across all of our companies. And so the reality is there's absolutely going to be a use case where whether it drives all the way up to a breach or even is just a level of unauthorized or unintended access, it's going to happen.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is why is it that people tend to go after identities, right? Because once you're in, like, even if you compromise one identity, now you have a catastrophic situation, because the potential for damage due to that one identity is extremely large. And a well-publicized recent attack, it was a multi-billion-dollar company that was brought down by a 10-minute phone call to trick the administrator at that company to give out a credential to an attacker. It brought down that company for weeks, and lots of losses. So identity attacks are becoming very lucrative, and that is why they're becoming very, very common. And if you see the latest Verizon data breach investigations report, DBIR, you'll see that there's also been a spike in sort of insider attacks, and what you talked about, the unintended access, is a big part of it. But because now you have these stricter compliance and reporting requirements, these things are being looked at more closely than before. And so, why is this happening, right? Because we are used to a model of working. We are kind of used to saying that, oh, let's provision these groups or entitlements or capabilities in various platforms across the cloud, and that creates this unseen risk, because as long as everything is working great, like everybody has access, they can do what they want. But if identity gets compromised, then you're in a crazy situation, right? So
yeah, and I mean, when you look at that, you look across the ecosystem, and the reality is, I think I'm in the way of your. Oh, maybe we should switch spots. The reality is you're accessing a lot of systems. You have a lot of users that access various systems, and managing that access is absolutely probably one of the larger challenges that you have across your company, right? When you think about access reviews, I'm sure everybody has had to deal with those, and the potential for access reviews becoming really that rubber stamp, because it's a lot of information to have to manage on a quarterly or semi-annual basis. And then the just authorization information that you have to track and manage on a regular basis. is, quite frankly, at some point in time, it becomes too burdensome to really be effective at managing. So we really want to be able to find ways to give us the right access, right? Get to that, zero standing privilege and zero trust model, but do it in a way that the organization and the company can actually manage that information.
Right. And if you get down to, okay, where do I want to control this access? You'll find out that it's not really in your data center anymore. It's all over the place, right? Because you have your infrastructure, your cloud infrastructure, you have your GitHub repositories, where people are checking in code, running production workflows, and things like that. And you have thousands of applications across your or maybe at least a few hundred applications across your organization, and all of those can be potential points where standing access can become a risk. And then finally, you have all the customer data that could be distributed across multiple such places, right?
Yeah, and when I look at this, what the reality that I look at as a customer is, you think about AWS, just use that as a perfect use case, and you think about all of the IAM roles and all the access you have. While you might end up getting really good at least privilege in that space and being able to apply specific access roles to an individual, there's still the likelihood that potentially, whether it's an SRE or DevOps or somebody doesn't necessarily need that access all the time, right? They may only be going in there with release patches or some type of change management or incident window, but that may end up being once a month or once a quarter, depending on the ecosystem that they have to manage. And you're sitting there with that potential access available to them at all times. So you're just expanding the potential for that user or that account to be compromised when it doesn't need to be from an access perspective.
Right. And so this has been in the focus for a few years now. Like some of the bigger companies have, you hear a lot of things at conferences like this company is doing this and that, but these are the things that the companies have actually talked about, right? Like Google. The blog that I mentioned was released in 2019, where they talked about how we can rethink the whole way of doing access evaluation by using the continuous access evaluation protocol. Microsoft made an announcement soon after that, and then recently Cisco announced that the future they see of access management is continuous. So I'm sure companies like yours as well has had these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're just now getting into this space ourselves. Obviously, we've been working towards a zero trust model for a little while, and trying to apply that methodology. But the reality is, again, in key environments and ecosystems, the zero standing privilege has a huge value add if you can do it right. So over the last probably year to 18 months, we've actively been evaluating how do we get into this space, what do we do.
And so if you have to ask the question, okay, we understand that we need to do this, and so where do we begin, and how do we sort of get started? These are some of the areas that you will see that are obvious issues, right? Do your SREs need access all the time to all your AWS accounts and all the resources within those AWS accounts? Do your customer service representatives need access to all your customer records all the time, right? And these are the kinds of things that you end up with as a result of static access, right?
Yeah, and the thing that we see in this is also the fact that when you get into some of these scenarios, the reality is business tends to take over, right? You've got that that view of I've got to get something out quick, I've got to move, and the idea of going through and managing a bunch of individual access, say I've got the right thing, I've got to do this, it's not sustainable. So where do we have the opportunities to do this in a more streamlined way? And again, we see these pretty consistently across the board, where there's just, again, too much standing access and too much access overall because of the complexity of how we have to do this.
Right. And so if you think about it also on the consumer side of things, like the customer side of things, right? This is sort of what is now being talked about as ITDR, right? Where if you've detected a threat, like if you've detected anomalous behavior, or if you've detected some credential stuffing or those kinds of attacks going on. So there are pre-breach, breach, at the time of breach, and then post-breach kind of analysis that you can do to figure out that something is wrong. But if you know that in one of your systems, how do you propagate that to all your systems, right? And I'm sure you've thought about that problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, silo is a big thing, right? Being able to act on data and information, right? When you think about a SIM and a SOAR and all those capabilities, there's a level of automation that you can provide in that, but really getting to that point of actioning on events across systems in relatively real time is a huge opportunity to, again, reduce that blast radius. How quickly can you respond to something that doesn't need human interaction, or you can get it to the right people and the right resources in the quickest amount of time?
Great. So before we get into what we should do, let's just take a look at what cannot really work, right? Because if you have to do manual updates for manual permission changes for every little change that you want to do, that's not sustainable anymore, because if you want to do this dynamically, you're going to have to do that much more often than in a static kind of way, if you're doing it in a static kind of way. And if you have to do it in a more fine-grained method, like for example, if I'm logging into my AWS infrastructure, do I really need access to all the AWS resources that are there? Or should I just be having access to the specific resources that need attention because I'm working on a ticket that requires me to log in, right? So you cannot really have manual processes in this case, right? And so the other thing we are seeing is that there's so many different entitlements, so many different roles, that there is a lot of sprawl in terms of policy, both in terms of the readability, because you have something that you've stated as the company policy, it's translated into all these different things. So these are some of the things, I'm sure, Mark, you can relate to what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I say, I mean, when you look at all of these areas, policy sprawl is pretty interesting, right? Because you've got so much out there, and again, it's about speed of business and trying to do things quickly, and it's not always securely, right? So, and of course, the access review is unfortunately near and dear to my heart, because it's a pain in the neck, and think about the idea of an access review that has to happen on a defined schedule with a defined set of users, and how do you get that into a much more streamlined, automated fashion? So these are definitely areas that, again, you're not going to be able to do this at scale in the long run.
Yeah, and I mean, especially in regulated industries where somebody's going to look at your access reviews and decide that whether they actually reflect the reality or not. And if it's a rubber stamp review and they find discrepancies, that's going to call into question all your sort of reviews, right? So it becomes a real liability in those situations. So,
yep.
And so let's see how we get from where we are to where we want to be, right? And so the first thing is you want to automate the granting and removal of permissions, right? So you want to have a system where you're not manually setting permissions and then taking them away. You want to do that in an automated fashion. Now, obviously, your question is going to be, how do we do that, right? Because the great thing is that you're already running your business on these systems that are capturing these decisions that your organization is making. Now I'm talking about ITSM, where your ticketing system, or your CRM, where you're having assignments of which customer service agent is working on which customer and those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, and this one's interesting because it actually really has two benefits to you, right? There's the security benefit of ensuring that you only have the right approvals or the right access that you need from a security lens, but it's also from a potential just bad intention, somebody making a mistake, right? Has anybody had the issue of somebody going in to make a production change when they shouldn't have, right? And they bring something down, not necessarily a security issue, but absolutely a business operations issue. Well, if they didn't have that access, outside of a change window, they wouldn't have been able to do that, right? So there's definitely benefit on multiple levels to really automate and streamline that access.
Awesome. I think we probably need to pick up the pace a little bit. So
Yep.
I'm going to zoom through the next few things. Like, you need to have policies that are human readable, and the reason is because if you're going to scale this at the level that we are talking about with dynamism, with fine grain, you cannot have a situation where you're writing your policies in one way and then you're having to translate that into like groups and entitlements that don't necessarily correlate, and then each application is going to have to do this interpretation of their own, right? Like, so that's sort of one thing. And the consistency part is very interesting because you think about, like, the way I think about it is your asset is your data, right? And that data has many asset access paths, right? You may have applications, you may have infrastructure, you may have your code and applications that are in source. You can make changes that are all ways to access that data, right? And as long as you cannot enforce a consistent way of doing things securely, it becomes a problem because you can lock one door and leave the other open, and then you have the same problem, right? So,
yep. Yeah.
All right, and so this is sort of this new concept that we are used to doing admin time processing, and we're used to doing login time processing, right? So we're making decisions when somebody logs in. But now there is a new thing, which is event time processing, where in response to some event, let's say your identity provider detects some problem with the user, or the user changes their credential at the identity provider. Now you need to take that event into account when you say, okay, as a result of this, I'm going to cut access to these applications, or I'm going to reduce access to these other applications. Sorry, I'm not giving you a chance to talk, but please.
Keep going. Yeah, but and again, this is another great opportunity from. You think about the capabilities that exist already, right? If you've got session revocation or skim process, but again, this is about an entire ecosystem. How do you trigger event activities across the board, right? Whether it's a session revocation or whether it's an access activity, it's being able to do that consistently in real time.
Right. And so, I think the way to approach this is to find the use cases that are going to be the most important to you, right? The thing that is going to bring you the most short-term advantage, because that is sort of the biggest risk that you see in your organization, right? It could be your cloud infrastructure, because that has the most amount of access, or in some cases it could be your customer data. If, let's say, in your B2C kind of environment, you're seeing fraudulent access or something like that. You decide, which way you want to go in this case, right? So, and then, if you have to convince your organization that this is worth it, you need to have some outcome-driven metrics. And, let's say if you can estimate that you have ambient access in the way that, so many engineers have access to my cloud infrastructure all the time. These are the number of resources that they can access at all the time. And using a dynamic platform like Signal, you can basically now curtail that to virtually nothing. There is a clear demonstration that, here is how I've reduced the risk in my organization, right? Feel free to interject.
Yeah,
whenever,
so in these two, I think from the measure perspective, I would be looking at it from a, your core role is to know who has access to what. Well, how can we measure that access is being reduced, right? So that standing access can be reduced by some percentage and giving you value in that level. And then from a prioritization perspective, absolutely you want to go towards your most critical systems. And again, crawl, walk, run, right? Don't start trying to boil the ocean. This isn't necessarily going to be something that you're going to do consistently across the board. It's something you're going to put into the most important things where you believe has the most value and impact. And
so I think then you need to codify the policies in a language that is understood by your compliance team as well as by your system, right? If you can do that, I mean, obviously something like Signal will support that, where you can take a policy that is human readable and it is actually the thing that gets executed. You need something like that so that you don't have to be stuck with like translating policies all the time, and then because you're operating at this fine-grained level, there's no really room for manual processes here, right? So
yeah, and on this one specifically, I can't tell you how many times just even in the access management, access review side of the world, how many times you're dealing with these cryptic, unknown, what are you even giving somebody access to? How are they making this decision about whether they should or shouldn't have that access? So human, clear language from a policy perspective is going to be key.
Right. And so here's the crux of the matter, right? Because we all the time we're saying that we're not going to make manual processes for making individual decisions. This information is is already in your business, right? You're already making decisions on who's on call in, let's say, a pager duty, right? You're already making a decision on who's assigned to which case in your let's say your CRM, right, or your ticketing system, right, or which customer service agent is responsible for which customer, right? You already know that in all your systems of record. You can leverage that, and use that information and use the events in those information, like the changes that happen, like case gets closed, case gets opened, gets approved. All that information can be used to now enforce access where you need it to be, where it could be in your cloud infrastructure, it could be in your GitHub repositories, like in your code, or it could be in your customer systems, right? And so this is something, obviously Signal provides it, but if you find a platform like that, that's something that you need, right?
Yep.
All right. So we are almost out of time. We'll keep some time for questions, but you can always talk to us outside in the hallway. And if you go to the next slide, if you scan this QR code, you will be entered into a raffle to win an iPad Pro, the new iPad Pro. So I'll leave the slide open, and please ask any questions.
As the phones all come out.
Questions? Yes.
So you talked about automated removal and granting of access. In practice, have you actually seen that? Is there an example?
Right. So the question is, what is a real-world example of granting or removing access automatically? So for example, let's say I'm an SRE and I need access, break glass access to AWS because something has gone wrong and it needs an engineer to actually log into the AWS console, right? Now, in your ticketing system, you already have kept track of, this case which relates to these resources, there's some issue, there's a VP level approval in there, and now all the SRE is doing is they're going to AWS directly, right? The identity provider is calling Signal and saying, okay, and you've written a policy that says, under these circumstances, the user should get access to that particular set of resources. The user needs to be on duty. They need to be in the the SRE organization. They need to be in the physical location that is allowed. Things like that. And now all the user is doing is clicking, I want to log into AWS, and they're in, right? Because all these conditions match. Now, if let's say the issue is resolved and the engineer closes the case, right? What we can do is then go out to AWS and pull those permissions out, right? But this is the event time processing that I'm talking about, right? Where the event here is that the case got closed. And so now we're able to reflect that in taking the permissions away, right? So back there, and then Jason. I mean, one of the challenges is sort of just the mindset that needs to change. And although, Mark has sort of his own technology environment that he works in, not necessarily related to Signal. Maybe Mark can also talk about some of the challenges you've had.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously on the beginning journey of this. I think the biggest challenge will be ensuring that you define the right policies, right? Because again, if you try to boil the ocean, you try to do too much, it's just like any implementation, right? If you go too big and do too much, it's not going to work the way you want it to. So from what we're looking at and how we're trying to position the business to potentially take on a use case like this, we want to just target particular areas and try to solve one problem at a time. So right now, I think it's really gaining adoption and understanding the environment. That's the challenge for us.
All right, Jason had a question, and I think we will have to end there because.
So thanks for the presentation. You know I'm a fan of this approach. I'm curious if you're seeing maybe resistance or a little bit of rocks you have to push up over to this, because this is a better approach, but it's also non-deterministic in some ways. So I'm curious, from an implementation and adopter, or even a product compliance perspective, do you have to do some of that? What is the mindset?
So the question is that, is this a non-deterministic approach, and is that a problem? So let me tell you, it's not a non-deterministic approach, because if you look at the manual steps involved, they're actually reflecting what you're already doing in the business, right? And we're just cutting out that manual process. I'll answer the rest of the questions out there in the hallway.
Thank you.